Night falls over Windsor Great Park. Behind ancient trees, one royal home glows faintly, a ghost refusing to leave. This is Royal Lodge, the $30 million mansion at the center of Prince Andrew's most notorious scandal. Sprawling across nearly 100 acres, it is no longer a sanctuary, it is a gilded trap. Imagine a house that costs $5 million a year just to maintain. Roofs leak, paint cracks, gardens threaten to overrun carefully sculpted lawns. Now imagine the man inside, a prince with no official role, no public salary, and a reputation fractured by one of the modern monarchy's darkest scandals. Outside the gates, anger simmers. Inside, the bills climb higher. The palace presses, yet he refuses to leave the home he calls his last safe place. But why? What secret deals, quiet promises, and personal fears are buried beneath Royal Lodge's manicured lawns? How long can one house withstand a royal scandal before it collapses under its own weight? It is autumn 2022. The iron gates are shut. Security vans idle silently. Beyond the bars, the house sits calm, white walls fading into shadows, trees standing sentinel. Yet everything has changed. News vans arrive first, followed by photographers, each shutter click punctuating headlines. Prince steps back, Duke loses titles, Royal Lodge future unclear. Inside, life continues in careful silence. Staff glide through corridors, dogs nap on antique sofas, kitchens still prepare meals, but the bubble has burst. The collapse did not arrive suddenly, it crept quietly, politely, like old foundations settling beneath weight no one wishes to acknowledge. The removal vans are not here yet, their presence is a warning. What once seemed permanent may not endure much longer. For decades, Royal Lodge symbolized comfort. It was where royals could drop the mask, walk dogs, read newspapers, and eat breakfast without cameras spying. King George VI cherished it. The Queen Mother made it her home for decades. Young Elizabeth played in its gardens, tasting fragments of normalcy in a childhood defined by duty. Then Andrew inherited the lease. Millions were poured into renovations. His daughters grew up within its walls. He tried to create a life insulated from scandal. He failed.
Now the house has transformed, from warm retreat to fortress, from royal sanctuary to financial burden, from private home to public lightning rod. And everyone asks, why not leave? The answer is tangled. Lease agreements, family loyalty, pride, and a lifetime believing that royal status shields from consequence. To understand how Royal Lodge became a stage for scandal, we must go further back, not to Andrew, not even to the recent headlines, but to the house's very origins. It was built as a hiding place, a retreat for those who needed to escape the crown without surrendering it. For 2 centuries, it worked. Royals rested here. Lovers met in secret. Widows mourned quietly. The house absorbed stories without judgment. But it was never designed for someone the nation demands accountability from. It was never meant to withstand a modern storm where privilege and scandal collide, where every unpaid bill, closed curtain, and refusal to leave becomes a symbol of everything people believe is broken in inherited power. The gates remain closed. The house still stands. Outside, the siege has begun. Once a sanctuary for privacy, Royal Lodge is now the eye of a storm. Royal Lodge was not always a mansion. In 1662, it was a keeper's lodge, modest quarters for staff managing Windsor Great Park's hunting grounds. Low ceilings, small rooms, built for function rather than grandeur. For more than a century, it remained that way. Royals passed on hunts but never stayed. It was simple, practical, a place to watch, wait, and maintain. Through the centuries, the house devolved, becoming a quiet refuge for royalty seeking a temporary reprieve from protocol. Lovers came, widows mourned, children played in the gardens. Privacy, not opulence, was its hallmark. Today, Royal Lodge stands as a paradox, a house built for secrecy, now at the center of exposure. A retreat, now a prison. A home, now a symbol. Its walls have witnessed centuries of royal life, and now one man's scandal threatens to redefine its story entirely.
The gates are still shut. The house still holds its breath. And the world watches, waiting to see if history will protect it, or if the weight of scandal will finally bring it down. It was too plain, too distant from the palace, too ordinary to belong to the world of crowns and ceremonies. Yet in 1812, the future George IV noticed it. Already reshaping Brighton into his fantasy palace and transforming Windsor Castle into a Gothic fortress, he saw promise in this modest lodge tucked among the trees. He ordered its expansion, new wings, additional rooms, classical proportions. A house large enough for a king, yet small enough to feel private. Years passed, and Royal Lodge emerged as something between a country house and a royal retreat, comfortable, elegant, never imposing. George IV visited from time to time. His brother, William V, preferred other estates. The house drifted in and out of royal life, a quiet refuge for minor royals and guests seeking privacy away from stiff palace corridors. Then came Queen Victoria. She never lived at Royal Lodge, but she understood its purpose instinctively. Windsor Castle was for duty, for ceremony, for the weight of the crown. Royal Lodge was for escape. Family members retreated here when court life became unbearable. The pattern was set. This was the house you went to when the palace felt too heavy, when you wanted to ride horses unseen, when children could play in gardens that felt almost normal. It was never about grandeur. It was about relief. By the early 1900s, Royal Lodge had settled into a rhythm. It welcomed younger royals, lesser titles, occasional guests. The rooms were cozy, not opulent. The grounds were beautiful, but relaxed. Staff later remembered it as one of the gentler postings, less ceremony, fewer rules. Royals stayed, relaxed, laughed louder, dressed more casually. The house absorbed their moods, becoming a sanctuary where exhaustion or doubt could exist without transforming into scandal.
This sanctuary proved crucial in 1931. King George V still ruled, but his second son, Prince Albert, the Duke of York, struggled under the weight of shyness and a crippling stammer that made public speaking torture. His elder brother, Edward, was confident, magnetic. Albert felt lesser, always in shadow. He needed a refuge, a place where he could exist without performance. George V offered Royal Lodge. Albert moved in with his wife, Elizabeth, and their two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. The family that would define the next era of Royal Lodge had arrived. For Albert, the house became a refuge. He practiced speeches in private, walked the grounds without courtiers lurking, learned to be a father away from photographers' lenses. His daughters climbed trees, built forts, played with dogs. Elizabeth, the future queen, later called Royal Lodge the only place where her childhood felt authentic. The house wrapped around them like a protective cloak, warm, quiet, forgiving. No one yet knew that Albert would soon become King George VI, or that Royal Lodge would serve as the haven where a reluctant monarch learned to bear the crown he had never sought. Albert ascended the throne in 1936, unexpectedly. His brother, Edward VIII, abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, thrusting the shy, stammering Duke into global leadership. Suddenly, he was George VI, ruler of an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. Fear and doubt overwhelmed him. Buckingham Palace was for work, Windsor Castle for pomp, but Royal Lodge remained his anchor. Even as king, he refused to relinquish it. Elizabeth understood instinctively. She transformed the house into a fortress of normality. Sunday lunches, garden picnics, evening walks with dogs. The girls still climbed the same trees, wore the same muddy boots, dragged the same soil through the halls. Royal Lodge became a place where pretense fell away. Here, the king could breathe. He could stumble over words without judgment, teach his daughters, and simply exist. The house carried their laughter, their cries, their quiet moments, absorbing life without spectacle.
Royal Lodge had always been modest in ambition but generous in spirit. Over centuries, it had grown quietly, a sanctuary for those who carried invisible burdens. For George VI and his family, it was more than brick and timber. It was a shield, a home, a refuge from history's relentless gaze. And within its walls, a broken man discovered the courage to become the king he had never imagined being, all while the gardens bloomed, silent witnesses to the quiet drama of ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances. In 1932, long before she became queen, the people of Wales gave Princess Elizabeth a gift that would shape Royal Lodge for generations, a miniature house called Way Booth and Bach, the Little Cottage. Nestled in the garden, it was a perfect child-sized replica of a Welsh cottage, 2 tiny rooms, working doors and windows, miniature furniture, a small kitchen with running water. Elizabeth and her sister Margaret ruled it like sovereigns of a private kingdom. They swept its floors, arranged the dishes, and held elaborate tea parties for imaginary guests. Here, being a princess meant nothing, no audience, no protocol, only freedom. The cottage still stands, a quiet witness to childhoods lived beyond the crown. When war came in 1939, Royal Lodge became something more literal, a hiding place. George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to evacuate London during the Blitz, but their daughters were sent to Windsor Castle for safety. Royal Lodge remained shuttered, dark and empty for months at a time, like a stage waiting for its actors to return. After air raids, the family retreated to its quiet halls, finding solace where the world outside was aflame. The house had no strategic value, no military importance, just rooms where a king could cease performing courage, admit exhaustion, and simply be human.
Staff recalled those years as long, tense silences. They remembered the king pacing late at night, smoking too much, worrying endlessly about his country, his daughters, the uncertainty of tomorrow. Yet Royal Lodge held him. It absorbed the weight of his private despair so he could emerge composed for the public. When the war ended, Britain survived, and George VI had proven stronger than most imagined, but the effort had quietly eroded his health. In 1952, he died suddenly of a heart attack in his sleep at Sandringham. Overnight, Elizabeth became the Queen Mother, and her daughter, Elizabeth II, ascended the throne. The old life was gone, yet the Queen Mother did not leave Royal Lodge. She could have chosen Clarence House, a grace and favour apartment, or a smaller estate with fewer memories. Instead, she stayed. For 50 years, she preserved the home as a living memorial to her husband. His books remained on the shelves, his favourite chair by the window untouched, photographs scattered across every surface. The gardens became her obsession. Flower beds widened, new paths were laid, and the grounds slowly transformed into one of England's most beautiful private gardens.
The little Welsh cottage endured. Her grandsons, Charles, Andrew, Edward, played there as children, just as Elizabeth and Margaret had decades before. Royal Lodge became a repository of memory, a place where time moved differently, where loss could be honored, grief could be carried gently, and life could continue at its own pace. By her 90s, the Queen Mother and the house had become inseparable. Staff spoke of her in the present tense, even when recalling years gone by. She was always there, and she always would be, until 2002. In March 2002, the Queen Mother died suddenly at 101. Royal Lodge, hers for half a century, stood empty for the first time in 70 years. The family faced a choice. Some argued for a museum, others suggested splitting it into apartments for minor royals. A few voices proposed returning it to the Crown estate to be leased to someone outside the family. But Queen Elizabeth II had another plan. She offered the house to her second son, Prince Andrew, Duke of York. At 52, he had lived a life split between residences and responsibilities. His divorce from Sarah Ferguson 6 years prior had left him navigating a delicate balance. Grace and favour apartments at Buckingham Palace, a country house still shared with his ex-wife, and 2 daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, growing up between homes, titles, and the messy reality behind the official facade of royal life. Andrew sought stability, permanence, a place where his daughters could belong without footnotes or explanations. Royal Lodge, with its sprawling grounds, quiet rooms, and layers of family history, offered precisely that. It promised sanctuary, continuity, and the chance to build his own chapter in a house that had sheltered generations of royals before him. Here, amidst the echoes of childhood laughter, the shadows of grief, and the enduring walls of memory, Andrew found not just a home, but a living legacy to inherit, protect, and eventually redefine. In 2004, the Queen offered Prince Andrew a 75-year lease through the Crown estate. The terms were generous but complex. He would pay £250 a week in rent, far below market value. In return, he was responsible for a massive renovation, new roofs, updated wiring and heating, repaired stonework, and restored exterior details. The total reportedly reached £7.5 million. Andrew paid it without hesitation. This was no ordinary house. It was a vessel of memory and legacy. Every corridor carried echoes of the past, the footsteps of the Queen Mother, the laughter of his mother as a child, the quiet dignity of generations of royals who had called it home. He moved in with Sarah Ferguson. Legally divorced, they led separate lives, yet Royal Lodge became proof that their strange partnership had survived. Separate yet together, divorced yet united, they inhabited a mansion that existed in its own sealed universe. For Beatrice and Eugenie, it was sanctuary. Their childhoods had been shaped by tabloid scrutiny, every glance, every outfit, every misstep recorded and dissected. At Royal Lodge, the girls could disappear. They rode horses through the park, walked the estate's quiet lanes, and played in the Welsh cottage their grandmother had adored decades before. Here, childhood could unfold on its own terms.
For Andrew, the house represented redemption. His Navy career had ended, his marriage had crumbled. The press had portrayed him as a playboy, a buffoon, a prince who embarrassed the monarchy. Royal Lodge promised a new narrative: stability, family, purpose. He hosted gatherings, welcomed the Queen, Charles, and his grandsons for informal lunches. The house hummed again with multi-generational life, laughter, and quiet warmth. Andrew felt safe. The lease was secure, renovations were complete, his daughters were happy. For the first time in years, he had a role beyond titles and headlines. A father, a custodian of history, a steward of a house heavy with royal memory. For a time, it worked.
Expenses were manageable. He received funds from the Queen's private income, his Navy pension, and occasional earnings from public appearances and consulting. Maintenance costs were high, roughly $250,000 annually, but not unmanageable. Andrew furnished rooms, repainted walls, and gradually made the house his own. Almost imperceptibly, the lodge transformed from the Queen Mother's residence into Andrew's home. Yet the illusion of security was fragile. Photographs, friendships, and a series of missteps would soon turn his sanctuary into a gilded cage. The trap was already being constructed, invisible, inexorable. The lease Andrew signed was unlike any ordinary agreement. Most tenants pay market rates and trust landlords to handle major repairs. Royal Lodge operated under a different logic. The Crown Estate, technically owned by the monarch but run as a separate business, managed the property. Its portfolio ranged from London office towers to rural farmland to historic royal homes no longer in active use. Royal Lodge fell into the latter category. Too large for modern royal life, too valuable to leave empty, too historically sensitive to lease to just anyone. The solution was a 75-year lease at £250 per week, about £13,000 annually. By comparison, similar country estates rented for £500,000 or more each year. Andrew paid less than 3% of market value, but with strings attached.
He funded every renovation himself. Not just redecorating, but full structural restoration. Roofs stripped and rebuilt, plumbing replaced, electrical systems modernized, stonework repaired. He maintained the estate to Crown Estate standards, employing professional gardeners, tree surgeons, and ground staff. Regular inspections demanded immediate repairs whenever damp appeared, tiles shifted, or masonry cracked. Subletting was forbidden. Selling the lease was impossible. Even passing it to his daughters required Crown Estate approval. On paper, it was a neat bargain, low rent in exchange for responsibility. In reality, it was a long-term, expensive commitment predicated on the assumption of ongoing income. For years, that assumption held. As a working royal, Andrew received an annual allowance from the Queen's private funds, roughly £249,000. Combined with his Navy pension, investments, and consulting fees, he could sustain Royal Lodge comfortably. Yet the house was more than numbers. Inside, Andrew and Sarah created a life that baffled outsiders. Divorced yet cohabiting, separate wings, shared meals, independent personal lives, united parenting. Staff called it the arrangement. Visitors found it unusual. The tabloids mocked it relentlessly. But in practice, it worked. The girls had one stable base. Andrew had a purpose. Royal Lodge, centuries old, became a vessel of continuity and a rare pocket of calm in a life otherwise dominated by public scrutiny. For a while, Andrew believed the worst was behind him. Family, history, and fortune had aligned. Royal Lodge had returned to its original mission: shelter, security, and private life. But the house also carried rules, responsibilities, and weight. An inheritance not just of brick and land, but of centuries of expectation. Beneath its elegant facades, the foundations were demanding. The trap had been set, invisible yet inevitable. Andrew had companionship. Sarah had a roof over her head after years of financial strain and public shaming following their divorce. Royal Lodge absorbed the strangeness of their arrangement without complaint. It had endured far stranger households, mistresses sneaking in, secret marriages, royals who drank too freely or spent recklessly, decisions that would have destroyed anyone else. One more unconventional family barely registered in its walls. Andrew entertained constantly. Business contacts, foreign dignitaries, old Navy comrades, all came to the lodge seeking access to a prince, willing to overlook his reputation for a connection to power. The house amplified his status. He led guests through rooms once graced by his grandmother, pointed to gardens where future queens had played, and reminded them, and himself, that he mattered, that he was part of a story far larger than his own life. He craved that reassurance more than he would ever admit. His older brother, Charles, was heir. His younger brother, Edward, quietly effective. His sister, Anne, earned widespread respect for tireless work. Andrew, the spare, had fought in the Falklands and spent decades trying to prove relevance. Royal Lodge became the evidence of his existence, a tangible claim to importance, a place where history and family intersected with his own narrative. Yet the same lease that offered comfort also left him exposed. Millions invested in a house he did not own. Maintenance costs that would only rise as the building aged. A life intertwined with property that could, in theory, be withdrawn. The Crown estate owned the land. The Queen controlled his allowance. His position as a working royal justified both. Andrew's sense of security relied on all three pillars remaining steady. By 2010, cracks began to appear. Tabloid scrutiny of his business relationships intensified. Stories of financial impropriety turned royal spending into a minefield. Whispers about associates whose names would later prove toxic grew louder. Yet Andrew ignored the warnings. Within the gates, Royal Lodge felt solid, rooted in history. He believed it would always stand. He was wrong. By 2015, Royal Lodge had become Andrew's entire world. The house settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, as long as one ignored everything outside its gates. Mornings began with dogs. Several corgis and other breeds roamed freely, navigating antique furniture as if they owned it. Sofas softened, carpets collected fur, staff adapted without complaint. The house had its own life.
Breakfast was informal. Sarah often joined him at the table. They read newspapers, discussed the day in quiet voices, planned schedules. To outsiders, it was disorienting, a divorced couple functioning as though married, bound by history, loyalty, and habit rather than legal ties. The rooms reflected Andrew's tastes more than inherited tradition. He had stripped away the Queen Mother's florals and pastels, replacing them with heavier furniture, darker shades, and masculine tones. Photographs dominated surfaces. Andrew in naval uniform, Andrew with world leaders, Andrew with his daughters at various ages. The walls repeated the story he wanted remembered, a prince who served, who mattered, who belonged. Maintaining that story required a small army. Housekeepers, gardeners, cooks, security officers, drivers. The payroll ran into hundreds of thousands each year. The estate had to remain perpetually ready for a last-minute visit from the Queen, a family gathering swelling unexpectedly, or an informal tour led by Andrew, showing off the Welsh cottage and rooms steeped in history. Yet fewer visitors came than he had hoped. His official royal engagements had thinned. Ribbon cuttings and diplomatic visits dwindled. His role as special representative for international trade and investment had ended in controversy, criticized as costly and ineffective, occasionally entangled with dubious individuals. Royal Lodge became his compensation, a tangible role when the institution no longer required him as a visible working royal. Within its walls, he remained custodian of family memory, keeper of traditions, a link to his grandmother's world. Beatrice and Eugenie came and went, pursuing jobs, partners, and lives in London. Yet they returned often, keeping the house alive with laughter, footsteps, and echoes of the past.
For Andrew, Royal Lodge was a fortress, a bubble, a sanctuary from a world that had never fully accepted him, and a fragile reminder that stability is never permanent.
Royal Lodge remained Andrew's home base, the singular place where he and his daughters could shed the scrutiny that came with being minor royals, constantly evaluated for posture, expressions, and attire. The garden cottage retained its quiet authority, a kingdom of memory rather than play. Elizabeth and Margaret no longer staged tea parties, yet the building's walls whispered decades of childhood laughter. Occasionally, friends were invited inside, marveling at the tiny kitchen, the diminutive furniture, and the sensation that time had paused, frozen for generations. For Beatrice and Eugenie, Royal Lodge embodied simplicity, stability, and the rare feeling of an untroubled childhood, a counterpoint to their parents' divorce and the relentless glare of tabloids. Andrew clung to that meaning. If the girls loved the house, he told himself, then he had done at least one thing right. Security encased the estate like invisible armor. Armed police patrolled the perimeter, cameras monitored every approach, and alarms lined every door and window. Windsor Great Park stretched for thousands of acres, adding another layer of protective distance from the outside world. Within that bubble, Andrew could conduct his life as if the external narrative did not exist. He hosted dinners and long evenings with old Navy comrades, business associates, and guests who still addressed him with the deference he craved. Conversations circled familiar territory, war stories, deals in progress, complaints about journalists who never got the full picture. No one in those rooms contradicted him. Royal Lodge filtered out dissent as efficiently as it muted the noise of traffic and the wider world. News stories that portrayed him poorly were dismissed as personal attacks. Criticism was deflected onto advisors, missteps blamed on circumstance rather than oversight. Andrew's public standing may have been slipping, but inside the gates he clung ever tighter to symbols of status, the title, the house, the security detail. Royal Lodge became both sanctuary and echo chamber, a cocoon of selective reality. Meanwhile, the bills grew relentlessly. Maintaining a house of this size demanded ceaseless attention. Roofs required repairs, stone facades cracked, heating systems aged and needed replacement. The gardens demanded constant care, mowing, pruning, planting, replanting, all to appear effortless. Andrew's income did not expand at the same rate. The Queen's private allowance covered basic operations, but supplementary costs required other sources, investments, loans, favors, arrangements that would later invite scrutiny. He reassured himself, the lease was long, the house secure, the Queen would not let him fail. Outside the gates, however, the climate was shifting. Rumors and criticism accumulated. Questions arose about his judgment, the company he kept, and the optics of photographs and public appearances. Royal Lodge cushioned the early warnings. Inside, patterns barely altered. Dogs sprawled across sofas, newspapers cluttered the breakfast table, family photographs stared down from every wall. The bubble held, for the moment. The first cracks were subtle. Tabloid stories hinted at extravagant spending, scrutinized who funded private jets, and captured him at parties with individuals whose wealth derived from opaque sources. Taken alone, each story seemed survivable, embarrassing, yet not fatal. It was the kind of coverage faced by a royal too visible to ignore, yet not important enough to be shielded. Royal Lodge became the refuge to which Andrew retreated after each round of negative press. The house absorbed his anger and disbelief. Staff learned to read his mood, shorter tempers, longer silences, hours spent alone in his study with newspapers spread across the desk. Sarah defended him publicly. His daughters remained loyal privately. The Queen's silence was interpreted as tacit approval, yet the stories continued. In 2011, attention turned to his association with Jeffrey Epstein, an American financier and convicted sex offender. Andrew explained that the connection had begun through Ghislaine Maxwell, an acquaintance useful for business introductions. He claimed to have largely severed ties following Epstein's conviction. But then photographs emerged. Andrew walking side by side with Epstein in New York Central Park in 2010, years after the conviction, contradicting the narrative he had constructed.
Maintenance demands escalated. The £7.5 million Andrew had spent on renovations in the early 2000s was not the final bill. Old houses never stop asking for more. By 2018, new estimates predicted an additional £5 million in repairs, roofs, drainage, structural work that could not be delayed. Andrew did not have that cash. Most of his wealth had already been invested. The allowance from the Queen covered running costs, not major restoration. The lease that once felt protective now seemed like a trap. He could not sell the house to recoup funds. He could not walk away without losing everything already sunk into it. Royal Lodge owned him as much as he occupied it. Then, in 2019, the bubble shattered. Virginia Giuffre filed a lawsuit in the United States. She alleged that Jeffrey Epstein had trafficked her to powerful men, including Prince Andrew. She detailed encounters with dates, locations, and circumstances. One photograph was damning. Andrew with his arm around her waist, Ghislaine Maxwell smiling beside them. In the image, Andrew was in his early 40s, Virginia only 17. The protective walls of Royal Lodge, for the first time in decades, could not keep the story out. Andrew's first instinct was denial. He admitted meeting Virginia Giuffre, but insisted he could not remember the encounter. The photograph, he said, was genuine, but the situation was harmless. In his view, the allegations were entirely false, motivated by money, part of a sprawling American legal battle that had nothing to do with him. Advisors urged caution, stay silent, let lawyers respond, avoid feeding the tabloids. Andrew ignored them. In November 2019, he sat for an interview with BBC Newsnight, believing he could explain, clarify, and reclaim his reputation. The broadcast aired on a Saturday evening, 49 minutes that would dismantle what little remained of Andrew's public standing. He insisted he could not have been in London on the night in question. He had been at a Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter. He claimed he did not recall meeting Virginia, despite the photograph. At one point, he even suggested the image might have been altered.
He described his friendship with Epstein as a practical business connection. Staying at Epstein's properties, he explained, was a matter of convenience and logistics. When pressed on regret, he spoke of missed opportunities for networking, of connections rather than consequences. Only when pushed did he acknowledge the victims, and even then his tone implied that he felt more wronged by the scandal than they had been by the crimes themselves. The most damaging moment came when he justified a 2010 visit to Epstein's New York home, years after the financier's conviction. Andrew said he had traveled there to end the friendship face to face because it was the honorable and right thing to do. The phrase landed like a brick. The walls of Royal Lodge, long a haven, a filter against intrusion and gossip, could no longer shield him. The bubble that had sustained decades of relative comfort, stability, and illusion had burst. The fortress was exposed. The house that had once absorbed scandal now mirrored it, echoing the collapse of a life once contained and curated. Outside, the press roared. Inside, the corridors were quiet, but the weight of history pressed harder than ever. Breaking up with a convicted sex offender in person inside the offender's mansion did not read as honorable to the public. To viewers, it looked like a flimsy excuse, a man too close to the wrong person, unable or unwilling to admit the truth. The BBC interview went viral almost immediately. Clips tore across social media. Commentators called it a disaster, a slow-motion car crash, a textbook case of how not to handle a reputational crisis. Andrew walked away believing he had been clear, forthright, even courageous. The public saw something entirely different, a defensive, detached man, unable to comprehend why his choices appeared so indefensible. Within days, the palace made its decision. Andrew would step back from royal duties, not temporarily, indefinitely. He would retain his title, his honorary military roles, and royal lodge, but he would no longer represent the Queen. No more patronages, no more public engagements, no more pretense of meaningful work within the institution.
Royal Lodge, the house that had long been his refuge, narrowed into a singular territory, the only space where he still felt like a prince rather than a headline. Staff noticed the shift immediately. Long stretches passed without him leaving the estate. Visitors dwindled. Meals became solitary affairs, shared only with Sarah at the table. Beatrice and Eugenie visited when possible, but even their presence could not repair what had been broken on television. They loved their father, believed in his innocence, yet recognized the truth. The interview had confirmed every suspicion, every negative story circulating about him. Within the house, the atmosphere changed. Rooms that had once felt alive now felt dim. Quiet stretched into a weighty, uncomfortable presence. Andrew stopped hosting dinners, stopped guiding guests through the gardens, ceased the role of gracious custodian that had once given him purpose and pride. Security still patrolled the grounds, staff polished silver and tended the hedges, but warmth had drained from the house. Royal Lodge had transformed from family home into waiting room, a place to linger in hope for vindication that never arrived. Outside, the consequences compounded. Charities removed his patronages. Military regiments that had once claimed him quietly distanced themselves. Organizations that had proudly displayed his name scrubbed it from websites and brochures. The monarchy moved forward, treating him as part of history rather than the present. The Queen said nothing. Charles kept a careful distance. The message was unmistakable. Andrew was on his own. Royal Lodge became his entire universe. Without duties, without public roles, without allies, it was the last domain over which he exercised control. He monitored the news obsessively, recorded broadcasts, read every column. He watched his name become shorthand for entitlement, poor judgment, and scandal. The wars of the house could not shield him from anger outside, nor repair the trust he had lost. Yet he refused to leave. Royal Lodge was proof that he still belonged, that he remained part of a story larger than the scandals surrounding him. As long as he lived within its gates, he was still a prince with a narrative, not just a problem for the institution to ignore.
But bills did not bend to sentiment. Maintenance costs, staff salaries, security expenses, all arrived on schedule. Andrew's other income had evaporated. The Queen's private allowance continued, but other sources, consulting fees, paid appearances, investments, had disappeared. Running Royal Lodge required roughly £250,000 annually just to maintain the status quo. He no longer had a clear, reliable way to cover that. The house he had fought to secure, the property he believed would safeguard his future, was slowly dragging him toward financial ruin. September 2022 brought another seismic shift, the death of Queen Elizabeth II at Balmoral.
Andrew was present in her final moments, one of the few family members at her side. For a brief, fleeting time, scandal receded. He walked behind her coffin in the funeral procession, stood vigil at Westminster Hall. Cameras captured him in naval uniform, eyes damped with tears, a son grieving his mother. The public softened. For a moment, Andrew was simply family, not scandal. The reprieve was short-lived. King Charles III ascended with clear priorities: streamline the monarchy, cut costs, modernize the institution, and quietly remove anyone whose presence caused more problems than solutions. Andrew fit that profile perfectly. Within weeks, Charles's position was unmistakable. Andrew was no longer required, no longer useful in the new order of the monarchy. Royal Lodge remained his only refuge, yet it could no longer offer protection from reality. The bubble that had shielded decades of privilege and comfort was gone. Beyond the gates, the world had changed. Inside, Andrew clung to the familiar: security, walls, rooms, the lease. But the house, for all its history and solidity, could not insulate him from the consequences of a life under relentless public scrutiny. The fortress had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where comfort and danger existed side by side, and where every room echoed the consequences of choices made long ago.
The allowance ended. Suddenly Andrew stood on his own. No further funds from the Duchy of Lancaster, no support from the sovereign grant, nothing beyond the strict necessities of security. Officially, the decision was framed as practical. Andrew held no royal duties. He generated no value for the institution. Why, the message went, should public money sustain a lifestyle he had grown accustomed to? Andrew pushed back. He reminded everyone of his service in the Falkland War, years spent as a trade envoy, decades devoted to the crown. Charles did not budge. The military service was decades behind him. The trade missions had ended in controversy, and the BBC interview, the disaster that had humiliated the monarchy, hung over him like a dark cloud. From that point on, Andrew was financially on his own. The numbers were unforgiving. Royal Lodge alone cost roughly £250,000 a year for basic maintenance. Staff wages added another substantial sum. Security, technically funded by the Metropolitan Police but constantly under review, was estimated at around £3 million annually. Andrew's Navy pension brought in approximately £20,000 per year. Investments produced a trickle of income, nowhere near enough to cover the mounting bills. Sarah had no steady income. Her ventures had faltered, book sales stalled, projects collapsed. She depended on Andrew's financial stability, and that foundation was cracking. The house itself needed urgent work: roof repairs, exterior painting, window restoration, structural inspections. Estimates ran into millions. Andrew could not pay. He turned to Charles for assistance. Charles refused. The confrontation became family legend. Two brothers clashing over money, status, and loyalty. Charles saw Andrew as a liability, a man forced to face reality. Andrew saw a brother abandoning him at the worst possible moment. Palace advisers floated alternatives. Frogmore Cottage, recently vacated by Harry and Meghan, was ready, renovated, large enough for Andrew and Sarah, far cheaper to maintain. Andrew refused. Royal Lodge was home. His lease remained valid for decades. He had poured millions into renovations. Walking away would mean surrendering everything: money, pride, identity, and the illusion of permanence.
Pressure mounted. Charles held firm: no allowance, no exceptions. Andrew had a choice: pay for Royal Lodge himself, or accept a smaller, more manageable house. Friends and wealthy acquaintances quietly stepped in. Reports suggested loans, discreet financial support, shadowed investments. From the outside, it looked terrible. A disgraced prince, no official income, maintaining a multi-million-pound estate. Questions proliferated. Who was funding him? What influence did they expect in return? Andrew insisted all arrangements were above board. The public did not believe him. Royal Lodge transformed from sanctuary into symbol. A man with no job, no income, and a tarnished reputation living in an opulent mansion became shorthand for all perceived injustices of inherited privilege. Small groups of protesters occasionally appeared at the park gates, waving placards demanding he leave, calling for fairness, justice, accountability. The protests were never huge, but visible, persistent, enough to remind Andrew that the outside world still judged him. Inside, he retreated further. Newspapers went unread, social media was avoided. He built a careful bubble, insulating himself from narratives he refused to accept. In this self-constructed reality, he was the victim, unfairly maligned, misunderstood, attacked. Sarah remained his anchor. They ate together, watched television together, walked the dogs across the expansive grounds. Two people clinging to a way of life already slipping through their fingers, unwilling to voice the truth aloud. Meanwhile, the house betrayed them. Paint dulled, stonework weathered and stained, gardens tended with less precision. Corners were cut, small repairs were delayed. Royal Lodge, once pristine and proud, was fading, and Andrew was fading with it. Every corridor, every room seemed to reflect the slow erosion of fortune, status, and hope. The question loomed: how long could this continue? Andrew convinced himself he could outlast the outrage, that public anger would shift, that Charles would eventually relent. Each assumption was wrong. The siege had only just begun. The gates could not protect him forever. The walls could not hold back consequences. Royal Lodge, the fortress he had believed unassailable, was quietly turning into a trap, and Andrew was its unwilling prisoner.
A mansion in slow decay. By early 2023, Royal Lodge had begun to show the weight of years and neglect. The white exterior, once crisp and gleaming, had faded to patchy grey. Shutters sagged, window frames cracked and flaked. The quiet, constant maintenance that had sustained the estate for generations had slowed to bare essentials. Lawns were mown, but without the old precision. Flower beds were weeded, yet rarely replanted. Trees were pruned just enough to stay safe, not sculpted to delight the eye. Staff numbers had dwindled. Andrew could no longer afford the full team. Some roles were left vacant, others were merged. Long-time employees quietly left for steadier positions elsewhere. Royal Lodge felt emptier. Dining rooms that had hosted family meals now sat dark. Wings that demanded constant care were closed off, left to grow cold and silent. Andrew adapted by shrinking his world. Most days he remained in his study or bedroom. Whole sections of the house were left unused, heating turned low to save on costs. Sarah tried to preserve a sense of normalcy. When staff were absent, she cooked, tidied, and tended the house herself, chores that, a decade earlier, would have been unimaginable for a duchess. Yet even her efforts could not disguise the truth. Royal Lodge was failing. The roof needed urgent repair. Leaks appeared in multiple places. Temporary patches held for now, but a full restoration would run into millions. The heating system, decades old, groaned in winter. Rooms grew bitter, staff wore extra layers indoors, and Andrew's complaints about the cold became constant background noise. The stonework bore deep weather damage, cracks snaked along walls, drainage problems left puddles pooling around the foundations after heavy rains. Every delayed repair multiplied the next bill, like dominoes toppling across time. The house and its owner mirrored each other, once imposing, now visibly deteriorating, both unwilling to confront the full extent of decline.
Outside, photographers lingered at the edges of Windsor Great Park. Long lenses captured Andrew walking alone with his dogs, Sarah tending the overgrown garden, and the empty, dim rooms glimpsed through half-drawn curtains. The bubble had fractured. Royal Lodge still stood, a fortress in name, but its walls whispered of decline. The house, like its owner, was slowly yielding to time, circumstance, and the unrelenting pressure of public judgment. Each new image of Royal Lodge became a story. Each story poured fuel onto the fire of public anger. By 2024, the house was described not as a building, but as Britain's most hated home. Not because of its walls, its gardens, or its heritage, but because it had become inseparable from the man who refused to accept that his time had passed. The walls that had once shielded Andrew now felt like barriers he could not cross. The lease that once promised security had become a set of invisible chains. The status that had once defined him now throttled him. He had fought for Royal Lodge, believing it proved he still mattered. Instead, it had become proof of the opposite. The house was decaying, his reputation shattered, his fortune eroded, his family had moved forward without him, and still he refused to leave. The standoff could not last forever. Something had to give. The only question was whether Andrew would walk out on his own terms or be forced to go when his last defenses finally collapsed. In January 2024, the announcement came quietly. Buckingham Palace released a brief statement. Prince Andrew would be required to leave Royal Lodge. The Crown Estate had terminated lease negotiations. Alternative accommodation had been arranged. No explanation, no apology, just a dry administrative notice that quietly shattered decades of assumed certainty. Andrew had always believed his lease was untouchable. 75 years, legally binding, a contract that could not be broken without a courtroom battle. He was wrong. The lease contained conditions, maintenance standards, financial obligations, proof of long-term sustainability. On paper, he had failed. Renovations were unfinished. The maintenance schedule had slipped. Most crucially, he could no longer demonstrate the financial capacity to preserve Royal Lodge as demanded. From the Crown Estate's perspective, the reasoning was simple. Andrew had breached the lease. They were within their rights to act. His lawyers pushed back. The breaches were technical, they argued. Standards were enforced more rigorously on him than on other tenants. Whispers circulated behind closed doors. Other royal leases were not examined with this intensity. The real motive, they claimed, was political. Charles wanted his disgraced brother out. The public demanded a demonstration of accountability. Ending the lease was punishment dressed in contract law. Legally, debates could drag on indefinitely. In practice, the decision had already been made. The monarchy needed an example, a signal that no one, even a prince, was above consequence. Royal Lodge was the price. Negotiations ceased. The order stood. Andrew could leave voluntarily or face formal eviction. Either way, he would not stay. Frogmore Cottage remained available. 5 bedrooms, recently renovated, far smaller than Royal Lodge, but ample for Andrew and Sarah. Rent and maintenance were manageable. The property had once housed Harry and Meghan, a quiet symbol of royal exile, now offered to Andrew. At first, he refused. Moving meant defeat, admitting he was wrong, accepting that his rank no longer guaranteed privilege. Royal Lodge was the last fragment of his identity as a working prince. Without it, he was simply a disgraced man with a courtesy title,
no grand stage to display it. Sarah tried to bring him back to reality. Royal Lodge was physically failing. Legal battles would only prolong public humiliation. Yet Andrew clung to principles, promises he believed the Queen had made, a sense of familial loyalty, and a brother he saw as abandoning him to protect the institution. The facts were brutal. No income, no reserves for major works, no way to sustain the property even if he won in court. Staying meant watching the house rot in slow motion, staff disappearing, leaks spreading, plaster crumbling, his last visible symbol of status collapsing before cameras. Leaving meant public humiliation, moving into a house forever linked with Harry and Meghan, an echo of exile. Either choice meant loss.
The media swarmed. Commentators debated Charles's judgment, too ruthless or still too gentle. Radio phone-ins called for harsher action. Opinion polls showed overwhelming support for forcing Andrew out. Royal Lodge had become a national argument, less about bricks and gardens than privilege, consequence, and whether a king could hold his own family accountable. Protesters returned to Windsor Great Park. Their signs read, "Evict Andrew, no more royal freeloaders." Security held them at a distance. No clashes, no dramatic arrests, just a visible, patient line of public anger aimed squarely at one man and one house. Andrew watched from upstairs windows. Placards waved, chants drifted across the lawns. For the first time, he realized with numb clarity that he had become the villain in a story with no resolution until he left. Inside, time thickened. Days blurred into repetition. Meals, short walks, television, restless nights. Sarah began packing in stages. She had accepted what he still fought. Better to leave with some order than to be evicted in chaos. The house felt haunted. Every corridor held echoes. His grandmother's laughter, his daughters playing in the garden, the Queen sitting at the table for Sunday lunch. Decades of private life now felt like scenes from someone else's story, all unraveling because of decisions he could never undo. The king had drawn a line. Andrew could keep his title, appear in family photographs, retain the surface trappings of royalty, but he could not keep Royal Lodge. The mansion that had once symbolized validation, importance, and connection had, in the end, become a mirror of his decline. Its walls whispered truths he had long refused to face. Loyalty, reputation, and privilege could all be eroded by time, choice, and consequence. The house that once proved he mattered now proved something very different. That status, once unchallenged, could not withstand time and circumstance. The question that remained was simple yet cruel. Would Andrew finally accept reality and leave Royal Lodge on his own terms, or would the last chapter be written by security officers and lawyers, escorting him out of the home he had fought to claim as his forever kingdom?
In the spring of 2024, the moving process began. There was no spectacle, no cameras at the gates, no live coverage, just quiet logistics orchestrated by staff who had performed this sad choreography many times before for other royals. Andrew observed from a distance. He could not bring himself to fold his own clothes, to touch photographs on the walls, to dismantle the physical remnants of a life he had long assumed was permanent. Staff handled it all. They wrapped pictures in tissue paper, boxed books from his study, emptied wardrobes once filled with naval uniforms he would never wear again. Every room demanded decisions. What could be moved to Frogmore? What would be placed in storage? What should be given away? And what would be discarded? The process exposed the weight of a life layered into Royal Lodge over more than 20 years. Not just furniture or paintings, but letters from Navy service, gifts from foreign dignitaries, framed photographs from official visits that would never happen again. Each object represented a version of himself he still wanted to believe existed. Sarah took control of the practicalities. She had survived bankruptcy, public shaming, and personal upheaval before. She knew how to endure transitions that felt impossible at first and inevitable by the end. She sorted through kitchen cupboards, selected furniture that might fit in Frogmore, listed essentials for the smaller house, and earmarked items to remain at Royal Lodge for whoever followed. Staff moved with quiet, deliberate efficiency. Many had worked at Royal Lodge for years. They did not need Andrew to articulate his humiliation. It was visible in the way he drifted through corridors, avoiding eye contact. His grandmother's possessions were treated with care. Chairs, lamps, ornaments, carefully packed into storage. He could not bear to part with them, but Frogmore had no room for shrines to the past.
Beatrice and Eugenie arrived to help. They stayed briefly, faces tight, eyes red. The garden cottage proved hardest. They walked its child-sized corridors together, Andrew, Sarah, and the girls, dodging through doorways built for a different era. Silence hung over the space. This was where the girls had played, where childhood had been allowed to exist outside scandal, outside lawyers, outside headlines. The cottage remained immovable, too fragile to shift, too sacred to tear down. It would wait, as it always had, for another child to claim it. Beatrice wept quietly in a corner. Eugenie held his father's hand. Sarah documented the scene on her phone, not from memory, but almost like evidence of a crime. Andrew stood silent, absorbing the collapse of an illusion he had long maintained. Watching his daughters grieve for a home and a childhood they would never reclaim was a shattering moment. Early one morning, removal vans arrived. Large trucks blocked the driveway, making the move visible from the edges of Windsor Great Park. Staff loaded boxes in a steady rhythm, furniture wrapped in blankets, paintings slid into crates, decades of life condensed into a numbered manifest. Andrew remained upstairs as long as possible, watching possessions vanish into the trucks, each departure carving away a piece of himself. In the end, Sarah persuaded him to leave before the final truck pulled away. Better to go while Royal Lodge still looks inhabited, she said, than to be the last figure walking out of an empty shell. They drove to Frogmore. Andrew rode silently in the passenger seat of the Range Rover, Sarah at the wheel. He stared through the window as the only world he recognized disappeared behind him. The distance was short, less than 3 miles, but the loss felt deliberate, almost taunting. Frogmore Cottage awaited, modest, neat, freshly painted, well kept, but unmistakably small compared to Royal Lodge. 5 bedrooms instead of 30, cozy gardens instead of sweeping parkland. The rooms were labeled comfortable by estate agents, yet to Andrew they felt like a cage disguised as refuge.
The contrast could not have been starker. Royal Lodge had been a monument to his identity, a fortress of memory and status. Frogmore was containment, a test of humility, a place designed to remind him that rank did not shield him from consequence. And yet, within its walls, there was room to start again, to establish new routines, and perhaps to survive the collapse of an empire he had long assumed would always sustain him. The journey from Royal Lodge to Frogmore was more than a drive across Windsor. It was a passage through decades of personal history, through privilege, illusion, scandal, and loss. Each corridor left behind, each photograph packed, each chair wrapped in cloth was a surrender. And as the gates of Royal Lodge receded from view, Andrew faced the reality that the house he had clung to as proof of relevance, as a sanctuary, as a stage for identity, had outlasted him in significance. Royal Lodge would remain, the garden cottage would wait, the walls, gardens, and memories would survive for others, but Andrew could no longer call it home. And that, finally, was the end of an era. For Andrew, Frogmore felt painfully small. Every corridor, every ceiling, every room seemed constricted. The expansive wings and endless halls of Royal Lodge, the home he had claimed as proof of relevance, sanctuary, and status, were now a memory. Staff had unpacked the essentials, beds made, towels hung, kitchens stocked. A few familiar ornaments were placed where he would see them first, a small gesture of welcome in a house that could never truly feel like his. He walked slowly through the rooms. Furniture loomed oversized. Photographs crowded the walls. Everything that had settled naturally into Royal Lodge now felt absurd, disproportionate. And then the thought struck him again. This had been Harry and Meghan's home. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. Punishment written in floor plans. He moved like a ghost through someone else's story.
Sarah spoke in soft, practical tones. Frogmore was charming. The location was convenient. They would adjust. They could build something new. Andrew did not respond. That first night he could not sleep. The ceilings felt low, the walls oppressive. He expected the house to open into the vast spaces he had left behind. When Sarah found him at 3 a.m., he sat alone at the kitchen table, lights off, still. Not crying, not speaking, just absorbing the knowledge that this place would never feel like Royal Lodge. That home, that life he had built over decades, was gone. The illusion had shattered. There was nowhere left to hide. Royal Lodge now sat silent. Furniture had gone, photographs were down. Rooms that once hummed with decades of family life echoed only with footsteps of staff performing routine inspections. But a single question lingered. Who really owns a royal house? The answer was complex. Royal Lodge belongs to the Crown Estate, a vast portfolio neither wholly private nor fully public. It occupies a legal gray zone. The Crown Estate was formalized in 1760 when King George III surrendered income from royal lands in exchange for a fixed parliamentary payment. Today, the monarch does not personally own the estate, but neither can ministers treat it as ordinary government property. Properties like Royal Lodge exist in a liminal space, historically significant, tied to royal identity, but managed as commercial assets meant to generate revenue or serve strategic purposes. For 2 centuries, the arrangement functioned quietly. Royal Lodge housed working royals who performed engagements, toured hospitals, cut ribbons. In return, they lived in historic buildings maintained as a justified cost of monarchy. On paper, the trade-off worked. Andrew broke the balance. After losing his official role, he kept Royal Lodge, maintained the lifestyle, yet offered no public service to defend it. The math no longer worked. Reclaiming Royal Lodge was about more than leaky roofs or missed inspections. It was about redefining privilege in a modern monarchy.
The public instinctively understood this. Polls show support for royals living in historic homes as long as they contribute visibly. William and Catherine at Adelaide Cottage made sense. They worked, were seen, represented the crown. Andrew did not. He was a royal life without royal duties. The generous lease he had signed assumed a permanent working role. Once that role vanished, the deal became indefensible. But the situation also illuminates a broader issue. Royal housing is inconsistent. Charles at Clarence House, William at Adelaide Cottage, Anne at Gatcombe Park privately, Edward at Bagshot Park under lease. Each arrangement differs, shaped by tradition, negotiation, and family politics. No uniform policy governs these homes. Andrew's removal thrust this opaque system into public view. Questions once whispered are now debated openly. How much do these properties cost? Who pays the bills? If a royal stops working, should they lose a grace and favor home immediately, or is there compromise? There are no simple answers. The rules have always been flexible, applied case by case, responsive to internal dynamics and public mood. Royal Lodge became the ultimate test. The Crown Estate's stance is clear. Historical precedent alone cannot justify continued occupation without public contribution. Homes must have purpose, visibility, accountability. Andrew offered none. Critics argue the system itself is corrupt. Why should someone live in a mansion by accident of birth, subsidized by public funds, without earning their keep? Others defend tradition, citing continuity, heritage, and symbolic value of royal presence. In practice, the debate continues. Royal Lodge is empty, yet charged with significance. Its walls carry echoes of laughter, scandal, service, and family life. The house that once shielded a prince now stands as a mirror, reflecting both the collapse of one man's world and the evolution of monarchy in modern scrutiny. The lessons are visible in the peeling paint, the silent halls, the absence of life that once defined it.
For Andrew, the story is personal. For the public, Royal Lodge has become shorthand for the tension between inherited privilege and accountability, between ceremonial status and societal expectation. And while the estate waits quietly for the next chapter, one thing is undeniable. In a monarchy measured by deeds as much as birth, a house cannot defend a reputation. The monarchy has always sheltered non-working relatives. Royal houses carry symbolic weight, preserve history, and exist outside simple measures of profit and loss. Royal Lodge now stands at the center of that debate. The building itself is Grade II listed, protected as a historic structure. It cannot be demolished or drastically altered without official permission. Its survival as architecture is assured, but its meaning and its use are now in question. The Crown Estate faces choices. Royal Lodge could be leased to another family member under stricter terms, or parts of the property could open for public tours. It could host official events, conferences, or retreats, or it could sit empty, a silent monument while royal housing policy is reconsidered. Each option carries a signal about the monarchy Britain wants: a strict custodian of tradition, a lean, business-minded institution, or something in between, preserving heritage while demanding visible contribution and accountability. Andrew's lease reflected an older mindset: low rent, light oversight, quiet assumptions that status would last indefinitely, justifying almost anything. That mindset is fading. Royal Lodge is its clearest casualty. The house will endure. It has weathered 3 centuries of wars, abdications, coronations, and family dramas. Whoever moves in next will inherit its layered history: Georgian princes seeking privacy, widows finding sanctuary, reluctant kings needing escape, and now a divorced prince clinging to a crumbling fortress. The walls are the same, the gardens remain elegant. The little garden cottage where princesses once played stands in its corner, a monument to simpler days. What has changed is the meaning. Royal Lodge has shifted from emblem of comfort to cautionary tale, from safe haven to lesson in accountability.
Royal Lodge has never remained static. Each generation reshaped it, added wings, altered interiors, changed colors, turned it into whatever the current resident required. That pattern will continue. The question is how. One option is leasing the house to another working royal under new, explicit terms: higher rent, stricter maintenance requirements, regular inspections, and a clear contract binding privilege to duty. Princess Anne appears often in these discussions. Approaching 75, she maintains a heavy engagement schedule. Gatcombe Park is her private home. Royal Lodge could serve as a southern base to support official duties, while remaining a Crown estate asset. Edward and Sophie are another theoretical fit. Their workload has increased since Andrew stepped back. Royal Lodge could supplement Bagshot Park as a secondary residence. Both scenarios carry challenges. Anne is famously practical and does not need another house. Edward and Sophie are settled, and moving them risks looking like a symbolic shuffle to cover an awkward gap. A second possibility is limited public access. Royal Lodge could follow the model of Frogmore House or Clarence House, offering guided tours of select historic rooms, summer garden access, and educational programs about George VI, the Queen Mother, and the building's role in royal life. Ticket revenue could offset maintenance, and occasional access would show transparency, an invitation for the public to see a property indirectly funded by taxpayers. Security is a hurdle. The estate sits deep within Windsor Great Park. Parking, visitor facilities, and crowd management infrastructure would require substantial investment before the first ticket is sold. A third approach would repurpose Royal Lodge purely for official use. It could host state receptions, provide accommodation during visits, and offer discreet meeting spaces. The house would become a functional asset, maintained at high standards and regularly used, but not tied emotionally or politically to any one family member. This vision aligns with King Charles's goal of a slimmed-down monarchy. Fewer perks, more function, property serving the institution rather than individual comfort or privilege.
Royal Lodge, in this light, is no longer just a home. It is a barometer for modern monarchy. Its fate signals how the Crown balances heritage, accountability, and practicality. For decades, the house sheltered private lives and public scandals alike. Now it stands at a crossroads between history and reform. Every decision, from leasing, repurposing, or opening it to the public, will reverberate far beyond its walls, influencing expectations for royal privilege in an age when scrutiny is relentless and legacy is fragile. The building will survive, the gardens will bloom, the cottage will remain, but the unspoken lesson is clear. History endures, privilege does not. Royal Lodge will continue as it always has, shaped by its residents, but the rules have changed. A house that once offered immunity from consequence now demands accountability. The next occupant will inherit more than brick and stone. They will inherit a story in which status and duty are inseparable, and where the line between sanctuary and scrutiny has been permanently redrawn. A fourth, quietly whispered option exists, leasing Royal Lodge to someone entirely outside the royal family. The Crown Estate has occasionally done this with historic properties under strict conditions. A private tenant would be required to maintain the house to conservation standards, accept tight limits on alterations, and possibly allow occasional public access. The financial burden would shift to a private pocket, the Crown Estate would secure a steady income, and Royal Lodge would step out of the royal housing debate entirely. Yet such a move would signal a subtle retreat, a tacit acknowledgement that some royal homes are simply too expensive to justify as personal residences, and once one property is repurposed this way, pressure inevitably grows. Which will be next?
For now, no final decision has been made. Royal Lodge sits in limbo. A skeleton staff maintains the basics. Groundskeepers still mow the lawns, security teams patrol the perimeter, lights come on at night, but the house has no resident, no clear assignment, no defined future.
It has been here before. After George IV died, Royal Lodge drifted, underused and half forgotten. After George VI passed, it might easily have been closed or repurposed. Instead, the Queen Mother claimed it, giving the house another 50 years of vibrant, lived-in history. The building has survived by aligning itself with the needs of those who required what it could provide. Now, however, no one appears to need it. A 30-room mansion deep in a royal park costs millions annually to maintain. What modern royal truly requires such space? What role justifies that expense in an era of tight budgets and public scrutiny? The answers are uncertain. Royal Lodge was built for a world where royals needed private retreats, where sprawling estates were ordinary, and where a title opened every door. That world is shrinking, perhaps already gone. The house may endure physically, but its function will almost certainly change. It may no longer be a private home or a hidden refuge, perhaps only a beautiful, costly monument to a system that took too long to define its priorities and discovered too late that the walls were telling a story the family had never noticed. Royal Lodge is not merely Andrew's story. It is a mirror held up to an entire system, one that shields privilege, rewards status over service, and takes decades to confront truths the public already understands. Andrew's mistake was not in loving the house, it was in believing the house rendered him untouchable. For 20 years, he treated Royal Lodge as proof of his relevance, a tangible emblem of significance. Around him, reputation crumbled, yet the public saw something different, a man hiding behind walls, clinging to symbols he had not earned, demanding privilege while evading responsibility.
The standoff revealed a fundamental truth. Titles do not confer immunity. They only delay consequences. For the monarchy, Royal Lodge became the cost of credibility. Charles had to demonstrate that even family loyalty had limits, that being a prince offered no protection from accountability. Forcing Andrew out was not an act of cruelty, it was institutional survival. Yet the lesson extends beyond one disgraced prince and one sprawling mansion. Most will never live in a royal lodge, sign a 75-year lease on a historic estate, or face eviction from centuries of accumulated history. But many know the feeling of clinging to something past its time, a job that no longer fits, a relationship already over, a version of oneself that no longer aligns with reality. Andrew's tragedy was not losing Royal Lodge, it was wasting years fighting a battle already lost, pouring money he did not have into a house that could not save him, and believing status would shield him from the very problems it created. Royal Lodge teaches the same lesson it teaches everyone eventually. Walls cannot shield you from truth. Beauty cannot erase consequence, and sometimes the place you fight hardest to keep is the very thing destroying you. The house stands empty now, silent, waiting for whatever comes next. The real question is no longer about Andrew or even about the Crown Estate. It is about what we, as a society, allow tradition, status, and history to protect, and what we hold accountable when those protections fail.